The morning of June 6, 1944 began like no other in human history. In the cold gray dawn over Normandy, a German officer raised his binoculars, and what he saw shattered everything he believed about war. The horizon itself seemed to disappear, swallowed by a vast moving sea of steel. Ships, endless ships stretching farther than the eye could see. The English Channel, once Germany's proud barrier, had transformed overnight into a bridge of doom. Before we go deeper into this unbelievable moment, the morning the world changed forever, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because on this channel we bring you the most powerful, hidden stories of history, moments that defined humanity itself. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? We'd love to see how far these stories travel across the world. Now back to that morning, at 5 a.m., inside the fortified observation post of the Crisbeck battery, Oberleutnant Zursee Walter Omsen steadied his trembling hands. The concrete under his boots vibrated from the distant thunder of engines. Through his Zeiss binoculars he saw what looked impossible. An ocean turned metallic, filled with shapes upon shapes until they merged into one continuous shadow crawling toward him. It wasn't a fleet. It was a floating continent. He didn't yet know it, but he was staring at the beginning of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. In front of him moved an armada of .6 939 ships, warships, landing craft transports and merchant vessels. Over 195,000 sailors from 8 allied nations were steering this juggernaut across the channel, carrying the weight of freedom itself. At 5:52 a.m., the order came. The guns of the Crisbeck battery opened fire, sending shells arching into the mist. Omsen's massive 200 mm Czech-built Škoda cannons roared to life, their recoil shaking the very walls of his bunker. His target, the U.S. cruisers, USS Tuscaloosa and USS Quincy, and the battleship USS Nevada. At 6:30 a.m., one of his shells struck home. The USS Corey, a destroyer, exploded and sank beneath the waves, the only American destroyer lost on D-Day. But Omsen knew, even as he watched the flames, that it changed nothing. His shells were pebbles thrown at a rising tide. From that concrete fortress, Omsen became the first German officer to see and engage the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. But what he was truly witnessing was something much larger, the full power of Allied industry unleashed. The mathematics of defeat were heading straight for him, at 8 knots an hour. Across Normandy, as the first light touched the coast, German officers were seeing something that should not have been possible. They had been told for years that the Allies were weak, divided, incapable of producing enough for a serious invasion. But now the proof of their miscalculation filled the sea from horizon to horizon. In a single morning, every illusion the Reich had about its superiority began to collapse. The day before, June 5th, had given clues. At the headquarters of Army Group B, 50 miles inland, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was receiving confusing reports. Parachutes had been sighted. Aircraft were crossing the coast in the night. Yet Rommel himself wasn't even in France, he was in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday. Convinced by the weather forecasts that no invasion was possible, he'd left his command at the worst possible time. By 1:20 a.m., reports confirmed massive parachute drops across Normandy. Over 13,000 men of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were landing behind enemy lines. Brought in by Douglas C-47 Skytrains in St. Lo, General der Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding the LXK's Crime Corps, understood instantly what was happening. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a survivor of Stalingrad who had lost a leg in battle, and even he couldn't fully grasp the scale of what was coming. The Wehrmacht had prepared for an invasion, but not for this. Vice Admiral Friedrich Rüge, naval advisor to Rommel, had warned of this day. He'd spent months inspecting coastal defenses, begging for more mines, more guns, more obstacles. He knew the Atlantic Wall was brittle. "We were preparing to fight the last war," he later wrote. They were bringing the next one. And he was right. The German High Command had calculated that the Allies might attempt a landing. With 20 divisions and maybe 3,000 vessels, an estimate based on their own capabilities, not their enemies'. But by dawn on June 6th, they realized their mistake. It wasn't a few thousand ships, it was nearly 7,000, not a limited operation, but the greatest amphibious assault ever assembled. At Strong Point WN-62 overlooking Omaha Beach, 20-year-old machine gunner Heinrich Severloh, just a farm boy from Metzingen who had never even seen the ocean before, watched in disbelief as the horizon vanished. "I tried to count," he later said, "but I stopped at 100. There were thousands." The sea was gone. At 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment began. 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors opened fire. The noise shook the world. The USS Texas alone fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns in just 1 hour. Each shell weighed 400 pounds and enough to level a building. In that single hour, one ship delivered 188 tons of explosives, more ammunition than many entire German artillery regiments possessed. By the time the first Allied soldier set foot on the beaches, the fleet had already fired 130,000 tons of shells, more destructive power than Germany could have imagined in one morning. General Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief West, later said, "We had prepared to fight soldiers. What came for us were factories." At 6 a.m., the second wave of the industrial storm arrived, not from the sea, but from the sky. The air above Normandy filled with the sound of engines, thousands upon thousands of them. Allied aircraft made 174 sorties that day. The Luftwaffe managed just 319. For every German plane in the sky, there were 46 Allied aircraft. Major Joseph Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, launched the only German air attack on the beaches that morning, just him and his wingman Heinz Wodarczyk. They made a single pass over Sword Beach, fired their guns, and fled from dozens of Allied fighters. It was a symbolic gesture, bravery against impossibility. On the ground, German defenders fought with desperate courage. The men of the 342nd Infantry Division at Omaha held some of the best defensive positions in France. Machine guns in concrete bunkers overlooking the beach, perfectly arranged for crossfire. When the first American troops from the 1st and 29th Divisions waded ashore at 6:30 a.m., the slaughter began. Bullets ripped through the waves, tearing through bodies and packs alike. The surf turned red. For a moment it looked as if the Atlantic Wall might hold, but then came the destroyers. At 8 a.m., with the situation desperate and General Omar Bradley considering evacuation, something astonishing happened. American destroyers, McCook, Carmack, Doyle, and Frankfurt, ignored every rule of naval warfare and charged straight toward the beach. They closed to within 1,000 yards, so close the Germans could see the men on deck. At that range, the destroyers turned their 5-inch guns on the German bunkers. Every shot hit. The tide of battle turned instantly. In those moments, German officers watching through rangefinders began to understand something far more terrifying than any gun or tank. The Allies didn't just have more equipment, they had an industrial mindset. To the Kriegsmarine, a destroyer was precious, irreplaceable. To the Americans, it was a tool. Lose one, replace it tomorrow. The USS Corey was gone, but within minutes others had taken her place. It was like fighting the ocean itself. And still the landing craft kept coming. Wave after wave, hour after hour. The Germans could barely reload before another flotilla arrived. The variety stunned even seasoned observers. Massive landing ship tanks, LSTs, beached themselves and opened their bow doors, releasing entire tank companies directly onto the sand. Smaller landing craft carried trucks, guns, and troops. Amphibious KW vehicles swam ashore and rolled inland with supplies. By nightfall, 56,000 Allied troops had reached the beaches, 132,715 by sea, and 23,400 by air. In one day, they landed more men, tanks, and vehicles than the entire German 7th Army had in Normandy. It was not a battle, it was an industrial avalanche, and the Germans had no answer. As the morning of June 6th unfolded, the defenders of Normandy began to realize they weren't fighting an invasion, they were facing an earthquake made of steel. For years, German propaganda had promised that the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable, a fortress built to last 1,000 years, but now the walls themselves were trembling. At Army Group B headquarters, telephones rang without pause. Messages poured in from every sector, reports of parachutes, naval bombardments, beach landings. No one could piece the chaos together fast enough. Lieutenant General Hans Speidel stared at the situation map in disbelief. The markers showing Allied forces multiplied faster than he could move them. The channel, once a shield, had become a highway for the enemy. Rommel, the man responsible for defending the coast, was still hundreds of kilometers away in Germany, caught between loyalty to Hitler and the grim truth he already suspected. He had begged for more coastal defenses, more mines, more men. He had warned that Allied air power would make daylight movement impossible. And now, as he raced back to Normandy, every one of his predictions was coming true. By the time he reached his command posts, the beaches were already lost. The once proud divisions of the Wehrmacht were being crushed beneath the weight of a war machine unlike anything the world had seen. The German staff officers tried to believe this was only the first wave, that the main invasion would come later at Calais, as their intelligence insisted. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception campaign, had worked perfectly. Dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, and a phantom army supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton had convinced Berlin that Normandy was merely a diversion. So even as the beaches filled with Allied soldiers and tanks, German reserves remained frozen far to the northeast, waiting for an attack that would never come. Meanwhile, on the coast, the defenders were fighting and dying with courage but no hope. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored formation close enough to intervene, launched its counterattack late in the afternoon. 10 miles separated its assembly area from the beaches, just 10 miles. Under normal conditions, that distance could have been covered in less than an hour. But under the eyes of Allied aircraft, it became an eternity. For 3 hours, the column crawled forward through burning villages and strafed roads. Every few minutes, another flight of fighter bombers screamed down, rockets flashing, guns blazing. Tanks exploded one by one, trucks turned to fireballs, and the survivors kept moving through the smoke. When the remnants finally reached the outskirts of Caen, they ran straight into British positions backed by naval gunfire. 15-inch shells from HMS Warspite and 16-inch shells from USS Nevada began to fall among them, shaking the ground like earthquakes. An SS commander, Kurt Meyer, later wrote, "Our tanks advanced like ghosts through a furnace. For every step forward, the sea answered with thunder. We realized we were not fighting an army, but an entire civilization of machines." Across the front, reports repeated the same story. Every road under attack, every bridge destroyed, every attempt to move met by swarms of aircraft. By nightfall, Rommel's staff could barely communicate. Allied jamming cut radio signals, destroyed telephone lines, left units isolated. The front was dissolving, and then came the moment that broke the German command's confidence completely. On June 7th, D-Day +1, reconnaissance planes brought back photographs that senior officers refused to believe. The Allies weren't capturing ports, they were building them. Out at sea, in what had once been open water, rose entire artificial harbors, massive concrete blocks, floating piers, sunken ships turned into breakwaters. These were the Mulberry Harbors, assembled from prefabricated parts built in Britain. In total, they contained 600,000 tons of concrete, 10 miles of floating roadways, and nearly 100 ships deliberately sunk to calm the waves. Within 2 weeks, these artificial ports were unloading 9,000 tons of supplies every day, more than some of France's largest natural harbors. The German officers stared at the photographs in silence. For 4 years, they had spent fortunes fortifying the existing ports, believing control of harbors was the key to stopping an invasion. The Allies had simply made the question irrelevant. They had eliminated the need for ports entirely. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, understood the meaning at once. He told his superiors in Berlin, "We are not facing an army. We are facing an industrial enterprise." In Berlin, Hitler refused to listen. Furious that the invasion had not been thrown back into the sea, he demanded explanations. When Rundstedt finally lost his temper and shouted, "Make peace, you fools, what else can you do?" he was immediately dismissed. Rommel went next. On June 17th, he met Hitler face-to-face at Margaville. Calmly, he presented statistics. Total Allied air superiority, divisions reduced to 30% strength, daylight movement impossible, supply lines cut. His conclusion was simple: Germany could no longer win. Hitler's response was rage. Retreat was forbidden. Every man would fight where he stood. Rommel left that meeting knowing the truth. The war was already lost. A month later, his name would appear in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. When the conspiracy failed, he was forced to choose between a public trial that would endanger his family or suicide. He chose the latter, taking a cyanide capsule in his car. The Desert Fox was gone, and with him vanished the last trace of reason in the German high command. Meanwhile, on the beaches, the Allied advance was turning Normandy into a lesson in industrial warfare. German artillery fired courageously, but ran out of shells. Allied ships never stopped firing. Their floating supply lines fed them without pause. For every German tank destroyed, the Allies landed 3 more. By July, the airfields behind the beaches were already operational. From them, swarms of Thunderbolts, Typhoons, and Mustangs ranged across France, striking columns, railways, and bridges. German divisions could move only at night, and even then headlights risked death. Every day that passed, the difference grew wider, not only in numbers but in philosophy. Germany still fought a soldier's war, measuring strength in divisions and courage. The Allies fought a technician's war, measuring strength in fuel consumption, tonnage, and logistics. On July 7th, 467 RAF heavy bombers dropped 2,500 tons of explosives on Caen in 40 minutes, more firepower than the entire Luftwaffe possessed in France. When the dust settled, the city was gone, and with it the illusion that German resistance could delay the inevitable. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, among Germany's best, entered the Normandy campaign with more than 20,000 men and 150 tanks. 6 weeks later, it had fewer than 300 survivors and no tanks left at all. Then came Operation Cobra, the American breakout. On July 25th, 500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers concentrated 300 tons of bombs on an area barely 6,000 by 2,000 yards. The earth itself seemed to erupt. A German commander trapped in the bombardment radioed his last message. "My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting soldiers. We are fighting an industrial complex." When the smoke cleared, entire divisions had ceased to exist. Of 3,000 men in the target zone, 1,000 were dead, another 1,000 wounded, and the rest too traumatized to fight. Even friendly fire couldn't slow the Allies. More than 100 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed in the European theater, died in accidental bombing. Yet the offensive rolled on as if nothing had happened. By mid-August, the Falaise pocket closed. Between 10 and 15,000 Germans were killed, 40 to 50,000 captured, and hundreds of tanks, guns, and vehicles destroyed. The survivors who escaped were broken remnants fleeing eastward through roads lined with wreckage. For the German General Staff, the realization was complete. They were no longer fighting an opponent. They were being erased by mathematics. The numbers told the story with merciless clarity. In 1944, German industry produced 39,000 aircraft, 18,000 tanks, and 68,000 military trucks. That same year, the United States alone built 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and 650,000 trucks. The ratio was 5-to-1 in every category, 10-to-1 in vehicles. And that didn't include Britain, Canada, or the Soviet Union. Former Chief of Staff Franz Halder would later write, "By 1944, the Allies' advantage in war production was 5-to-1, in some areas 10-to-1. We were not defeated, we were mathematically eliminated." Those statistics crushed morale more effectively than any bomb. Young officers who had grown up worshipping Nazi ideology were forced to confront a nightmare truth. The enemy they had been taught to despise was not weak at all. The Americans weren't lazy. They were efficient. They had machines to lift, radios to coordinate, and fuel enough to practice endlessly. They fought with organization instead of fanaticism, and that made them unstoppable. Even the most loyal officers began to break. Suicide rates among field commanders spiked. They were witnessing the end not just of an army but of an entire worldview. Beyond numbers, Germany faced a technological gap it could never close. The Allies had radar that guided naval guns with pinpoint accuracy, proximity fuses that turned near misses into direct hits, and vehicles for every purpose: bridge layers, mine clearers, amphibious trucks. Where German doctrine demanded sacrifice, Allied engineers designed solutions. By July, daylight movement for German troops had become suicidal. Allied fighter bombers patrolled the skies in cab ranks, waiting for forward observers to call in targets. Within minutes, rockets and bombs fell wherever resistance flared. Every attempt at counterattack met the same end: fire from the sea, fire from the air, and endless convoys from the west bringing fresh troops and supplies. In less than 3 months, the dream of a 1,000-year Reich collapsed into dust and numbers. The Atlantic Wall that Hitler had promised would hold forever was broken in a single day, and the lessons written across the sand of Normandy would echo for generations. Germany had gone to war with courage, discipline, and experience, but courage cannot stop factories, and discipline cannot replace fuel. The men who survived began to understand. This was not just defeat. It was the end of an era, the death of the soldiers' war. By the end of August 1944, the thunder had faded, but its echo would never stop. What remained of the German army stumbled eastward through the wreckage of Normandy. Long columns of men walking beside shattered tanks, trucks burnt to skeletons, horses pulling what was left of an empire that had once dreamed of ruling the world. To the survivors, the defeat was more than military. It was spiritual. They had believed in destiny, in willpower, in superiority. Now they knew the truth. They had been fighting mathematics. Inside the ruins of command bunkers, officers studied reports that read like obituaries for their own system. The Allies had landed more than 2 million men. 500,000 vehicles, nearly 4 million tons or men of supplies, and flown almost 500,000 sorties. Germany, battered by bombing, could not even replace what it lost each week. Every comparison felt like an equation already solved, and it always ended with the same answer: defeat. For those who had grown up under the black and red flags of the Reich, this realization was unbearable. Many officers ended their own lives rather than face capture or the emptiness of survival. Those who lived began to think differently. They had seen courage fail before machines. They had seen strategy erased by logistics. They had watched the sky fill with more planes than they could count, and the sea with ships beyond imagination. Hans Speidel, Rommel's former chief of staff, would later say that D-Day was not just a battle, it was an education. "We learned that courage and discipline cannot replace engines and production lines," he admitted. Years later, he would help build NATO, turning his old enemy's methods into his nation's new defense. Other veterans of Normandy followed the same path. They became advocates for European unity, understanding that the only way to survive in the New World was cooperation, not conquest. They had fought against industrial democracy and learned that democracy could outproduce any dictatorship. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had commanded in Italy, compared his experience to Normandy's catastrophe. In Italy, he wrote, "We could still fight them man to man. In Normandy, we were erased by their industry, and nothing symbolized that realization more vividly than what one man saw from his bunker 40 years later. In 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Ohmsen, the same young officer who had fired the first German shells that morning, returned to the Crisbeck battery. The Atlantic wind was cold again, but the guns were silent. Standing in Bard, the same observation post where he had once watched the horizon vanish under steel, he looked out over peaceful waters. To the crowd of veterans around him, British, American, Canadian, German, he spoke softly. 40 years ago, I stood here and saw the impossible, a sea of ships from horizon to horizon. That day I understood everything I had been told was a lie. Weak nations do not build 7,000 ships. Divided nations do not land 150,000 men in a single day. I fired my guns at that armada, and might as well have thrown stones at the tide. The men listening, many of whom had faced those guns, said nothing. The only sound was the sea, gentle now, whispering against the Normandy shore. What Omsen and his comrades realized that day was the final lesson of the war. In modern conflict, industrial capacity is military capacity. The endless rows of ships and tanks were not just weapons. They were factories made visible, the strength of free economies turned into motion. The German officers who had once watched those ships approach had seen more than an invasion. They had witnessed the future. The old world of professional armies and heroic charges was gone. The new age belonged to systems, machines, and the nations that could feed them. Their defeat was not a failure of bravery. It was a shortage of fuel, steel, and time. Not a collapse of courage, but a collapse of arithmetic. That is why the image of D-Day remains unforgettable, because it was not only the beginning of liberation, but the end of illusion. The men in gray had prepared for war as they understood it. The men in khaki brought war as industry understood it. Across that 50-mile front, history shifted forever. From that moment onward, every general, every engineer, every factory worker who studied the Second World War learned the same truth, that victory is built, not declared. The side that can replace, rebuild, and resupply faster will always outlast the one that cannot. It's why the bulldozers that pushed aside burned-out panzers became more important than the tanks themselves. It's why the hum of American trucks crossing the French countryside became the sound of inevitability. And yet within this avalanche of steel, there were still human hearts. Young men on both sides who felt fear, hope, and duty. The German soldiers who fought until their ammunition ran out. The American medics who ran through gunfire to save enemies, as well as friends. The French civilians who opened their doors to the wounded on both sides. In that chaos, something extraordinary happened. Compassion survived. Perhaps that's why the veterans who returned decades later did not speak only of guns and explosions. They spoke of the faces they saw, the hands they shook afterward, the understanding that in the end, all of them had been swallowed by forces larger than themselves. For the Germans, D-Day became a mirror reflecting what they had refused to see. That tyranny can control armies but never outcreate free people. For the Allies, it became proof that cooperation could do what conquest never could. And for the rest of us, it became the moment the world began to rebuild. Because when you look at those black and white photos, the ships stretching from horizon to horizon, the sky crowded with planes, the soldiers stepping into the surf, you are not just seeing war. You are seeing the cost of unity, the price of freedom, and the weight of human invention. That sight changed everything. It ended the myth of invincibility, ended the idea that one nation could dominate through willpower alone. It showed that the power of many working together could overcome even the darkest empire. So when Omsen said, "I might as well have been throwing stones at the tide," he was telling the truth. Because what he saw was not just an army, but the tide of history itself, rolling forward, unstoppable. That tide still moves today, and in every factory, every classroom, every collaboration where people choose to build instead of destroy. And that's why these stories matter, because they remind us that progress is not an accident. It's built by hands, minds, and hearts working together, the same way the Allies built the victory that morning on the beaches of Normandy. If you've felt that same chill imagining those gray waves filled with ships, if the courage and the tragedy of that day moved you, then don't just scroll away. Subscribe now, because this channel is where we keep those echoes alive, where forgotten voices and hidden moments from history come back to life in every video. Every week we tell stories that prove how ordinary people, united by purpose, can change the world. Hit the bell, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share what you felt hearing this story. Did you picture that endless armada? Did you imagine the silence afterward? Your thoughts help shape the next story we tell. Because remembering isn't enough. We have to understand. And when you understand D-Day, you understand the world we live in. You understand that freedom was not given. It was built, piece by piece, by millions who believed it was worth everything. So keep watching, keep learning, and keep their legacy alive. The waves of Normandy are calm now, but if you listen closely, you can still hear the low hum of engines far away, the sound of history moving, the sound of freedom approaching. That morning, nearly 7,000 ships crossed the channel and nothing would ever be the same again.